With chapter 23 and lecture guide number 5, we move into the period of Baroque art in the 17th century. The 17th century was a period of great upheaval as the fortunes of some countries increased while others sank and diminished. Ongoing religious wars are continuing to define the European map at this time, and art becomes increasingly distinctive in its ability to express emotions. From the drama of the Counter-Reformation, Italy and Spain, to the absolutism of France, to the free market of the Dutch Republic. In a time when we're experiencing shifting political powers and geographical changes, rulers' strength in some of these countries economically is slipping away. So artists find themselves looking for and securing patronage in the church, as we have seen earlier with rulers, popes such as Julius. Artists are finding patrons in the church and a prosperous middle class. Baroque art is distinctive from High Renaissance in its intention, which was meant to evoke intense emotional responses from viewers. Many artists seek very lifelike depictions in their portrayals and their portraits. Genre paintings, which we'll go into, are a key part of this period of artistic production, as are religious scenes and still life. As the church becomes more important in some ways at this time, one aspect of the church's reform effort, and when we say the church, we're talking about the Catholic Church, was to educate its members and helping them to understand more about their faith so they could be more faithful and appreciate their faithfulness more deeply. Most people were illiterate during this time, so this was no easy task. The Council of Trent declared that art should be used to explain the profound dogmas of the faith to everyone, not just the educated. In order to accomplish this, they were proponents of religious art that was meant to be direct, emotionally persuasive, and powerful, designated to fire the spiritual imagination and again inspire the viewer to greater faith and piety. The Council of Trent, as you'll find in your reading, is what? It's a counter effort to Protestantism on the part of the Catholic Church. It's the Catholic Church's defense. While the Catholic Church is a proponent of this enhanced emotional art that is available on a visual level to an illiterate congregation, new denominations like the Calvinists, the Protestants, coming from Martin Luther, believe that churches and church services should be very simple, stripped down, the roots of Protestantism. The Council of Trent and the Catholic Church are arguing that a God of greatness and a God of power should be worshipped with all kinds of pomp and ceremony, rituals, and grand churches bedecked with what in some other cultures is called idolatrous, golden idols, befitting the divineness of this Godhead. And this affirmation, this idea of the beauty and grandiosity of expressions of faith finds its way into Baroque art. Martin Luther focused his critique on what he saw as the church's greed and abuse of power. He called Rome the whore of Babylon, Rome the seat of papal power, which was decked out, again, in this grand architecture, this sumptuous art, and was in something that was also part of a fair amount of celebration and sumptuous banquets on the part of the clergy. So the church responds to this crisis being attacked by Martin Luther in two ways. One, it does internally address its issues of corruption, which were made by Martin Luther, and by defending the doctrines rejected by the Protestants, this idea of grandness and panoply in the sanctums of the Catholic Church. So, while the first 2 decades of the 16th century were a period of lavish spending for the papacy, as we see with the Sistine Chapel, with Julius commissioning Michelangelo and Raphael and other artists, the middle decades after that are a period of prosperity. What are we looking for when we're talking about Baroque art? Images that are direct, obvious, dramatic, images that try to to draw the viewer in, to encourage them almost to participate in the scene, as we will see in compelling images such as the Calling of St. Matthew and St. Teresa of Avila in Ecstasy. Depictions that feel very physically and very psychologically real, that are emotionally intense. We see this dramatic use of color and contrast, especially with artists like Caravaggio, as well as Velázquez. Dramatic contrast between light and shadow. As opposed to Renaissance art with these very clearly defined, mathematically defined planes, with each figure placed in isolation from each other, Baroque art has a continuous overlapping of figures and elements. It's, as we see in Bernini's David, the fourth of the Davids that we'll look at, this robust, athletic, in motion quality to it. If we look at the way figures are rendered, such as Judith, when we look at her beheading of Holofernes, we see this very strong palette and this very active imagination at play. We see as common themes these ecstasies and conversions, martyrdom, death of saints, very intense light that provides a way of thinking about the intense psychological moments that the subjects of these portraits, such as St. Matthew, are experiencing. When we get to the still life genre, we'll be looking at, just as we looked at coding before with the rich tapestries and garments in a portrait like the Arnolfini marriage, we will see these other elements of a painting, in this case inanimate ones, objects such as food and fruit and flowers, very heavily coded with meaning and with symbols. Going back to Baroque style religious painting, again, its association with Catholic Europe being Italy, France, Spain, and at that time Flanders, the early incarnation of the Netherlands. If it's non-religious, such as still life, such as landscapes, such as portraits, then these images are likely coming from Protestant Europe, most obviously Holland and England. There are some exceptions to this rule, however, because some Dutch artists, such as Rembrandt, who is Dutch, chose to paint religious paintings for patrons and no longer perhaps rulers, but in the middle class and also sometimes for clergy. So Baroque art is emerging in Rome, the artistic capital of Europe at this time in the 17th century, and it's spreading to other European countries where it's merging with local traditions and cultures. Religious paintings continue to be important to dominate, but we also see royal portraits, landscapes, again I mentioned still lifes, and paintings depicting private and court life as well as historical and religious events, referencing Zurbarán's Serapion and Holofernes' beheading as some of the subjects we'll look at. At the same time, royalty and rulers, even though this is beginning to fade as they lose their grip on power, they're still commissioning portraits of themselves to display their grandeur, even if it's starting to fade. When we think about, going back to, again, images such as the Arnolfini portrait, well, we can think about how in the 17th century, aristocrats and other wealthy people, wealthy merchants, are really no different from people today. They use their available technology and tools, that time, paintings and other visual arts, to show off their wealth. Commissioning an artist to paint an elaborate portrait of yourself in order to hang it in your house was a status symbol, similar to today's latest smartphone or buying a Tesla. Baroque art owes its roots to this religious tension that persisted well into the 1600s, that being the 17th century. We see the Catholic Church losing large parts of its power in Europe. And this major revolt by many Christians who protested against Catholic traditions and teaching, and the rise of the Protestant Reformation, to which the Catholic Church's response, once again, was the Council of Trent. In Catholic Europe, art's main purpose was to glorify Catholic beliefs and the Church itself. In a time of religious conflict, there's no second thoughts really about using art for political purposes. The Church is the wealthiest and the most powerful organization in Europe alongside European royalty, as well as being very powerful as the Church in its own right. So this idea of creating these very dramatic, colorful, sometimes almost grotesque, arresting biblical representations in visual, ecclesiastical terms, but also colorations and contrast, was again an easy method to address and impress the ordinary illiterate population. Was it propaganda? That's a question for us to ponder, and one that will inform our readings and lecture guide. The Church is commissioning art with a populist appeal, not for the well-educated elite, once again, before what we're calling the common or peasant class. This marketing campaign of sorts appeals to people and tries to draw them back into the Church by commissioning artists portraying dramatic, vivid scenes of biblical stories, miracles, and saints. These commissions initiated the era of Baroque art. It's very closely tied to the idea of Baroque art and this idea of a Catholic counter-Reformation, counter-Protestant instrument, tool, agenda. Another element of this phenomenon is the way in which this Catholic, we can even call it mysticism, enlists worshipers, enlists the populace to become of the congregation by making them feel, not just intellectually think, as in Renaissance times, but to feel. In this sense, it's reactionary and authoritarian. These are elements of this Reformation, which is not so much about rationality and humanism and independent thinking as it is about pure feeling. And if we think about the way painting and sculpture closely describe these moments, we think of perhaps Saint Teresa, the meditations, the religious ecstasy, the entering into a state of transcendence and swooning. So in this way, the Catholic Church with its idolatry is somewhat, we can even call it decadent during this Baroque period. To return to Saint Teresa, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini, Giovanni Lorenzo Bernini, who is also the sculptor of the fourth David that we are looking at, he's drawing on a common theme for Baroque artists, the miraculous moment where the divine meets the earthly, when the sacred intrudes upon the profane. Who was Saint Teresa? She was a mystic, a nun, who recorded an experience in which an angel came down and pierced her insides, her innards, with the flaming arrow of divine love. The idea is that this pain was so great, yet sweet, and brought her into ecstasy with God. The Baroque use of light in the sculpture is also on display. We see these wooden rays coming down in this spectacular fashion. They're lit by a yellow paneled window above the sculpture. We also see light coming in through the window when we look at Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew. So there is this idea of light and transcendence when we are talking about these depictions of religious figures. And this also harkens back to the idea of the Passion of Christ, this period of intense suffering in Jesus' life from the Garden of Gethsemane to the crucifixion. To some, the Passion of Christ evokes images of rather gruesome punishment. We can think of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Is there more to it than that, than just an extreme, compelling emotion or intense emotional drive? What else are we witnessing when we think about this idea of the Passion of Christ? The source of the Passion of Christ is thought as, in the liturgy, as his intense love for mankind that called from him the ultimate sacrifice, which was to give up his life in order to serve mankind. A reminder and an emphasis again that although we study a fair number of images in these audio lectures, as well as in our text, the focus is always on the lecture guides in terms of images upon which you are tested. For a short discussion of St. Teresa, if you have not already listened to the audio in slide 1 of this audio lecture, chapter 23, at 12 minutes, a brief description of this sculpture can be found. This change of perspective that gradually introduces the viewer in a new way and privileges the viewer's perspective begins to be seen in the 17th century, and by the mid 19th century, we see it gaining a whole other level of importance. I'm including here again some work from Jeff Koons with the idea of his gazing ball with the Mona Lisa, and underneath that in slide 14, Edward Manet's Olympia, to reaffirm and emphasize this idea of how by the 21st century, the viewer's perspective is not only acknowledged, but one might question with Jeff Koons, almost even being mocked, as he introduces this idea of a blue gazing ball mounted on an aluminum shelf into which we gaze as we simultaneously view a reproduction in his studio of a masterwork painting. As they enter the piazza, the faithful are embraced by Bernini's own description of his colonnade, shown here, are embraced by the motherly arms of the church. The colonnade becomes at once a dramatic frame for the church, this nurturing enclosure for the crowds of faithful, as well as a stage for processions and other sacred spectacles, which at this particular period the Catholic Church strongly depended on for its appeal. Remember, we are in the period post-Reformation where the Catholic Church is actively in need of and soliciting converts, especially those who left the church in favor of Martin Luther's new religious movement. The second area of the colonnades is surrounded by two, let's call them semicircles of a 4-row colonnade. Because, as Bernini said, quote, considering that St. Peter's is almost the matrix of all churches, its portico had to give an open-armed maternal welcome to all Catholics, confirming their faith, to heretics, reconciling them with the church, and to the infidels, enlightening them about the true faith. In this and the few next subsequent images, I'm introducing again this idea of reimagining the trajectory of architectural, painting, and sculptural masterworks of an earlier time in a way that traces their history and shows us new ways of thinking about these structures or artworks. In this continuation of the way contemporary artists reimagine the past, here we see Ai Weiwei's, one of the world's most visible, prominent, arguably important artists who often works with activist themes, recreating the idea of medieval stained glass windows in a Kunsthalle, in a museum in Germany. By the time that we arrive at Monet's, not Manet's, Impression Sunrise in 1872, we'll be at a period where the viewer is given a whole new kind of agency in terms of incorporation into the image. what they think matters. Just as with Impressionism, with Impression Sunrise here, Monet tells us what is important is what he feels as an artist and the way he is able to convey that, looking at that sunrise. Not a commissioned portrait, not something that he must create to the specifications of a patron, be it a wealthy merchant or the church, but the agency that an artist in this time of the 19th century, when we arrive there, brings to bear on his work. So this is just another teaser of what lies ahead, but something to keep in mind as we look at this trajectory that develops the viewer's participation and the change of the artist's role in making work. As we consider Bernini's David here, all athletic, tension, striving, twisting in motion, the fierce determination upon his face as he readies himself to slay his foe, Goliath. Think about how radically this David differs from Verrocchio's, from Donatello's, from Michelangelo's, four very different versions at different periods in time of the idea of David and the way that the biblical story of David and Goliath is interpreted by each artist. When we think about Caravaggio, we could call him the bad boy of Baroque. We can think about a painter who rendered his subjects in this very true to form, almost in your face, fleshy, vibrant, vivid, some might even say rough, unrefined manner. Certainly he was not the favor of some critics. On the other hand, he was exactly what the Catholic Church needed. The rendering of subjects in an expressive, emotive way that would connect them to the church post-Counter-Reformation. Some critics rejected Caravaggio's naturalism as too brutal. It wasn't dignified enough. In contrast to the noble, idealized, classical humanism, human forms favored by Renaissance artists, Caravaggio preferred to paint people, paint scenes, very much as I would see them, natural, unglorified, all flaws included in their natural state. He was definitely not sentimental and did not sentimentalize his subjects. He rendered them, perhaps as a result, more powerful, believing instead that the intrinsic nature of a scene, its narrative, the eloquence captured in his figures' real poses, was even more effective. Sometimes these paintings were so realistic that patrons rejected them as vulgar. Returning to that subject of appropriation, here on the right we see the, at this point, almost iconic 20th, 21st century photographer Cindy Sherman rendering herself. She only uses herself as a subject in a great variety and diversity of subjects' poses over a number of decades now, rendering herself as Caravaggio's Bacchus. In Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, we see this beautiful, almost elegiac, commemorative moment, the moment that inspires Matthew to follow Jesus. Christ walks in on the right. We see his delicacy in comparison to Matthew, who's wearing a black hat and a dark tunic. Matthew's a tax collector. He's sitting there with other tax collectors, and he points to himself, as in, what, me? It's the moment of Matthew's conversion, his spiritual awakening, which is a very typical subject in Baroque art. If we look at, as we have with other images, such as the Arnolfini double portrait, we can recognize how this image is coded. These are men who are richly attired, well off, who are collecting money. as if they were smoky backroom cards. Christ is shown in a more contemporary way. These figures are removed from the high Renaissance. What Caravaggio does so deftly, so well, is to bring the spiritual down to everyday, to the pedestrian, to the sort of dirtiness of these dark murkiness and shadows. This is not part of the high Renaissance. This is in Rome. It's the Baroque period. It's quite different from almost the high mindedness of the high Renaissance. The piercing rays coming through this window interrupt the moment that's suspended between calling, receiving one's vocation, and conversion. That is also very much a part of a real moment. These ways, these Baroque depictions of how the divine enters everyday life are also found in St. Teresa, and also if we think back to the Moralde altarpiece. Baroque style takes elements of the Renaissance and builds on it. It employs some elements of high mannerism, but it makes them more real and accessible, almost gritty and immediate. We see the slight bend of Christ's hand under the window, and this may recall, if we think about the Sistine Chapel, about Michelangelo and about God in the hand of man. In this way, we might recall the idea of Christ as a sort of second Adam. Adam causes the fall, and Christ redeems man from it. Artemisia Gentileschi was an Italian Baroque painter, widely considered one of the most accomplished in the generation following Caravaggio. And certainly we can see in her brushwork, in her dramatic use of light and dark, and the robust, fleshy athleticism of her subjects, Caravaggio's influence. However, Artemisia was a standout on her own, not only in her standing in the community, when very few, if any, women painters were accepted by the art salons or patrons. She was the first woman to become a member of the Accademia di Arte del Disegno in Florence, which was a leading art school of that time. She also was someone who, in a way, was a predecessor of the Me Too movement. She was brutally raped by her tutor, and she took him to court. She lost that case, but she went on to become a renowned painter, not only in Italy, but also in England, where she was commissioned by Charles I to create many other paintings. Artemisia's self-portrait here is not only a striking example of masterful painting, but for its era, and even for subsequent ones, a standalone example of a woman claiming her place as an artist at the forefront of the pantheon of artists.